All right, now let's continue on discussing what I mean when I talk about what is a species. So the morphological species concept, this has to do with just looking at morphological characteristics. So the morphological species concept is the smallest groups that are constantly and determinately distinctive and distinguishable by average means. So in this case, it's simply we are looking at the characteristics of these species. Okay, so the characteristics of individuals, you look at a whole bunch and they have all these same physical, unchanging characteristics. So by average means a whole bunch, the average individual looks like a particular way. Okay. So species are the smallest natural populations permanently separated from each other by distinct discontinuity in a series of biotype. In other words, the morphological species concept states that a species is a community or a number of related communities whose distinctive morphological characteristics are, in the opinion of a competent systemist, sufficiently definite to entitle it to a specific name. So in this case, it takes into account, you need to be a scientist, you need to be somebody, a taxonomist, somebody who is well versed in all these different physical characteristics. And you have to use that background knowledge in order to say, okay, yeah, this is a significantly different look to a species. So therefore, this is going to be called a different species. So I have a bunch of pictures of flies up here for you. A lot of these are different species, and some are pretty obvious. I mean, this is a blowfly. Here's a flesh fly. Here's another blowfly. Here's a housefly. All these different species, they have these significant characteristics that are different from one another. Here's blowfly, fruit fly, drainfly. They're all flies, but they look different. So according to the morphological species concept, somebody who is really practiced in identifying things sat down and compared the blowfly to the housefly, say, and said, okay, we've got these major characteristics that are different. In this case, it was the arrangement of hairs on their back, the different wing veins, the different type of spurs on their legs, hairs on different thoracic segments, that sort of thing. And they said, we looked at a whole bunch of flies that look really close alike, and we found that one group, the house flies, had certain characteristics, while the other group, the blowflies, had other characteristics. Okay. The problem with this, though, is that these morphological characteristics are subjective. They depend on quote-unquote expert opinions for these key traits. And in some cases, the species are what we call sympatric. They're morphologically indistinguishable, but they're from clearly different lineages. So they live in different areas. They don't mate. They don't do that sort of thing. The upside of the morphological species concept is it can be applied to both sexual and asexual organisms, and it can be useful for species in the fossil record. But there are those problems with it. So again, just like these other two species concepts, this doesn't quite cover absolutely everything we need to cover. Next is what we call the phonetic species concept. So the phonetic species concept is based on the idea that a species concept shouldn't be bound by any precise theory. So the scientist who came up with this concept came up with it in 1993 and gave this definition. A species is a set of organisms that look similar to each other and distinct from other sets. That's kind of a vague definition, isn't it? But it's vague on purpose. The idea is that you can have this species where you look at it and say, yes, I can see that this is different from everything else. Therefore, we're going to call it a species. So this can apply to asexually and sexually reproducing species. It can apply to species in the fossil record, all of that sort of stuff. So it's going to clarify some particular degree of phonetic resemblance, and that similarity, that idea that they're the same or different, is measured by something that we call a phonetic remoteness statistic. So this phonetic species concept can be thought of as an extension of the way that species are recognized in practice. This idea that you can look at something and recognize them by their morphological characteristics. So those flies we saw before, or when you're looking at a dog versus a cat, right? You have this idea of what a cat is in your head. You know that cats have certain characteristics, and you know that they're different from dogs. Okay. So it's this set of morphological characteristics that somebody who knows these species understands that they're different. So a phoneticist then says that a species are groups of individuals with certain morphological characteristics. Informally, the phonetic species concept defines a species as a set of organisms that look similar to each other and distinct from other sets, but more formally, it specifies some exact degree of similarity. So there is a statistic that you use in order to measure this. So in practice, this phonetic concept measures as many characteristics as possible in as many organisms as possible, and then identifies these phonetic clusters using multivariate statistics. So these really complex statistical tests are then used to say, okay, yes, this is alike or this is different. The smallest unit in these clusters has sufficient similarity then to be called a species. So the theory of a phonetic species concept can be opposed on the basis of that to a specific degree. There's a resemblance between two objects in a universe. I mean, at what point do we see these as grouping different or grouping the same? Moreover, members of the same species can be significantly different in looks. I mean, think about males and females of certain birds. They look very, very different, but they're in the same species. And individuals of various species may look more related to each other than members of the same species. There's mimicry out there. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on out there. So, in order to achieve better classification based on phonetic similarity, some principles need to be followed. You need to have a great content of information. More characters and more taxa should be attained. So the more information you have, the better off you're going to be. Each trait needs to have equal weight when forming natural taxa, and the overall similarity between two taxa, between two units. This is going to be the result of their individual resemblance among many traits used to compare them. The taxa can be identified and recognized because of correspondences of characters that differ in groups of organisms under investigation, and then taxonomy is usually viewed and practiced in an empirical sense. So it's out in the world. So this just gives you an idea of our phonetic grouping. Okay, are they different? How do they look? Do they have isolation? So it's basically taking a whole bunch of information all together and trying to group it that way using statistics. Finally, the evolutionary species concept. So not all taxonomists, especially paleontologists, are satisfied with some of these other concepts. They prefer a definition of species that are related to evolution. So in the early 60s, a scientist proposed a definition with many modifications that states an evolutionary species is a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of populations, evolving separately from others with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. So this definition is not only consistent with the biological species concept, but it helps to clarify and remove some of the limitations of those other species concept. So it's related to this phyletic lineage, but it is not as wide, say, as some of these other species concepts. So the evolutionary concept is applicable only to the isolated population, an incipient species, but not applicable to a single species. So you have to look at things as a whole in order to get this biological or this evolutionary species concept in relation to the biological species concept. So there's been several revisions of this definition. A little later, a scientist revised this definition, stating that an evolutionary species is a single lineage of ancestral descendant populations that maintains its own identity from other such lineages and has its own evolutionary tendencies and its own historical fate. Okay, so it has evolved based on a bunch of different inputs. So we can look at these finches. I mean, we use a lot of Darwin's finches, right, in order to analyze this sort of stuff. And so in this case, we are looking at these different finches and how they have evolved over time. So we see they all sort of came from the same basic finch, but as they started isolating themselves, as they started having natural selection act upon them, they started speciating into these different groups. So you got these sipping finches that feed on nectar, these that feed on insects, these that crush seeds. So you have all these different species concepts throughout. Okay. Later, in the 90s, there were a few revisions to this concept. So in the early 90s, a group of scientists stated that the concept has developed on the basis of a species taxon, not on a species category. And then a little later, as a scientist proposed the ontological species concept. That is, a species is a single lineage of ancestral descendant sexual populations, genetically integrated by historically contingent events of interbreeding. So this put stress on that interbreeding nature of a species. So that brought it back to the biological species concept. So this one has a lot to do with genetics. It has a lot to do with the lineage, and it has some of that biological species concept involved there. This is used extensively in comparative biology and in phylogenetic systematics. So those of you who are interested in going into comparing different species, into phylogeny, that sort of thing, this is the species concept you're going to use. But no matter how you define a species, new species arise through a process that we call speciation. In speciation, an ancestral species splits into two or more descendant species that are genetically different from one another and can no longer interbreed or no longer use the same evolutionary or ecological niches or whatever definition you decide to use. Now, Darwin envisioned speciation as a branching event. In fact, he considered it so important, he depicted it as the only illustration in his book on the origin of species. And this is the illustration that he put in there, this sort of branching idea of speciation. So a modern representation of this idea is this tree of elephants here. Okay, so what this does is it reconstructs the speciation event during the evolution of this group. So it starts out with this common ancestor, which then starts to branch off into all these different areas. So it ends up with all these different genera, these different families, these different orders, all based on or from the same common ancestor. So for speciation to occur, two new populations must be formed from one original population. And they must evolve in such a way that it becomes impossible for those individuals from the two new populations to interbreed or to exploit the same niches or to evolve in the same manner. So they just go in different directions. So you can think about like these three here, right? You've got your mammoth, your Asian elephant, your African elephant. They're all branching out in different ways. They're no longer going to be interbreeding. They live in different areas. They're reproductively isolated. All those different things, all those different concepts, and they look significantly different. So they have that metamorphic difference, those for that species concept in common. So biologists often divide the way that speciation can occur into two broad categories. The first is called allopatric speciation. Allo means other, and patric means homeland. So in this case, it involves the geographic separation of population from a parent species, and then the subsequent evolution. So what happens here, let's go back to our elephants here. Let's say they all came from this paleomastodon, and there was some sort of event where one group suddenly got isolated from this main group. So a group wandered off and maybe it got stuck on an ice floe and then made it to an island. Or there was a big earthquake and a new row of mountains came up and it can no longer interbreed with that root population, that ancestral population. So now evolution and natural selection is going to act on this population independent of this original population. So things are going to look different over time. So that is allopatric speciation, a geographic separation of the population and subsequent evolution. Sympatric speciation is the other way this works. Sym means the same, and patric means homeland. And in this case, speciation occurs when the group stays together. And for whatever reason, there's some sort of mutation that happens where this group now splits apart. Maybe they just don't like the look of the other group. Something happens. And they all remain in the same space, but they no longer interbreed. So then we end up eventually with new species. So allopatric speciation in different geographical regions, sympatric speciation within the same geographic region. All right, so that was a lot of talk on how things speciate and these different concepts of species. So hopefully at least you have a general idea of how complex that question is. When somebody asks you, what is a species? Oh man, that's a loaded question. That is something that is really hard to define. And it is so loaded, in fact. This is a very common question for those of you who are sitting for your PhD. A lot of people get asked this, what is a species? And what you're being asked really is, how do you, given your work, given your information, define your species? Are you going to be dealing with the biological species complex, the morphological species concept, the evolutionary species concept? What are you doing, and how does that affect your investigations, your research, that sort of thing? All right. With that, let me know if you have any questions.